Hello and welcome to Outside Plant Fundamentals. This is a channel about OSP in the fiber optic telecommunication field. This video series, a 5-part series, is going to be about aerial attachment on poles. We're going to talk about governing bodies and the codes. In future videos, we're going to have pole terms and zones, applications to attach, your make-ready engineering and pole loading analysis, and then wrap it up with license to attach and construction. So this particular video, we're going to talk about governing bodies and codes. So the first one we're going to talk about is the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Now, this particular body of the federal government mostly focuses around the types of internet service that's provided to you and what those standards are, and the equipment that's within your home or sometimes on cell towers, small cell towers. This body governs those types of service. But in the early 2000s, we began to see a lot of new companies come into the market. And a lot of new materials were coming into the market. So, for instance, coax was moving out and fiber optic was coming in. So there was beginning to get really crowded on the poles. More and more people were attaching, and so it began where people had to move, or attachers had to move around on the pole to make room for the new attachers. And those moves started to take more and more time to get accomplished, and so someone would apply to attach to the pole, and it would take a really long time before there was space made for them on the pole because everyone had to move around. And the costs of these moves began to get higher and higher. At first, it was maybe one new attacher every, 5 or 10 years. And then it got to the point where you might have a new attacher once every year for several years in a row. So the cost of having crews go out and move those attachments over and over again started to become problematic in the early 2000s. So around 2015, around 2016, a lot of the attachers and the associations and the pole owners all came together, and they started talking about that they needed to create what they called a one-touch system, or some people also call it a self-help system. So this one-touch system was intended to reduce the number of times that any crew needed to go to the pole. So as we talked about a minute ago, if you have new attachers coming to a pole every couple of years, then what would happen is, let's say you had a pole out in front of your house and there was already 2 telecommunication companies out there, and now another one wants to come and attach. Well, you're already going to have 2 crews show up to move their attachments, and you might have the power company come and they might have to do something. And then finally, the new attacher shows up at the pole. So you would have 4 different crews coming back and forth to this one pole. And there was, getting to be a lot of complaints about that, how often crews were having to come to poles. And it's expensive, like we talked about. So these groups of attachers and associations and pole owners came together and said, we got to figure out a way to make this easier because it's only going to get harder. And so one of the things that they agreed on is that they needed to have this level of comfort, with what crews would be going out and moving other people's fiber, right? So if you have customers already on the pole, you don't want just some guy showing up and messing with your cable, and then you might have customers lose service, right? So one of the main points of the OTMR rules was recognized authorized contractors. So if you're a company and you want to avail yourself of the OTMR rules, the number one thing that you have to have is an authorized contractor with all the attachers that are currently on the pole. And that is one of the things that has made it very difficult to really apply these rules, is because every company has a slightly different idea of what they consider an authorized contractor, right? So that's what's made it inconvenient to really apply the OTMR rules to poles. And so finally, the FCC stepped in and they applied guidelines in May of 2019, so that all of the attachers, association pole owners could have a single guideline that they were working towards. Now, we still struggle to apply these rules that were applied in May of 2019, but it did give everyone a blueprint for how to move forward. The next body that governs the fiber optic field is the NESC. So the NESC is a code of safety that is created by the IEEE, and they publish it not every year, but they do have new versions that come out every few years. And these rules are guidance. It covers so many different things to do with the way we attach to the pole, not just the telecommunication, but also for the power and the pole owners. It gives them guidance on the safest practices when dealing with poles. Now, that is a voluntary standard that's published, and each pole owner has to choose to adopt those standards. And also, each state has to choose to adopt those standards. Now, the government agency within each state that chooses to adopt that voluntary code is your Public Utility Commission. So every state has a PUC, and every state chooses to adopt a particular version of the NESC. Now, when new versions are published, oftentimes they'll automatically adopt those new versions. Sometimes they don't. Again, this is all state by state. And then some states will take that NESC and they will make some slight changes. So they'll say, well, I agree with all of these parts of the NESC code, but I want to change these couple of different sections of the code. And so you have to go to each state, you go to their PUC, and they will publish online whether or not they adopt the codes as is, the version that they adopt, or their particular code that they're adopting. And then there's another level of that's a little more complicated, is oftentimes you will have the same pole owner within two different states, and they may have adopted slightly different versions of the NESC. So for instance, we have Encore and AEP and a lot of different large power companies that have poles within 2 or 3 different states. And so you might apply to attach to a particular pole for AEP in one state, and then you go to a completely different state and they seem to have completely different rules, and that can be really confusing. But the reason usually is because the NESC code version or the particular way they're adopting it could be different from one state to another. And so it's always really important that when you're applying to attach to a pole, that you're in contact with that pole owner about which codes that they are applying at that time to their pole. And then the fourth body that really applies to all telecommunication is the ASTM. So that's your Society for Testing and Materials. So the testing portion of it, you can go online. Generally, those testing standards have to do with the poles themselves, how we, and we're going to talk about this more when we get to the make-ready engineering and the pole loading analysis. But those standards also apply to every piece of material that is actually attached to the pole. So it's not just the testing of those materials, but it's the standards that they have to apply to. So if you have any new equipment that you intend to attach to a pole, that equipment will always have technical information, and they will call out which ASTM would be applied to that particular piece of material. So that's what that means. If you're ever looking at technical information, that's what they're applying for. So that's it for aerial codes. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll come back for the rest of this series.